Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Always great to be here.
Today we're diving deep into a book that's had a pretty huge impact on, business strategy.
It has.
Michael E. Porter's Competitive Strategy,
Yeah, published back in 1980.
1980.
A true cornerstone of business literature, for sure.
And for good reason, too. It lays out a framework for, thinking about competition and achieving a competitive advantage. And honestly, for anyone listening who's interested in the business world at all, it really is essential reading.
I would agree with that. It's one of those books that changes the way you see the world.
So let's do this. Let's give our listener a quick overview of the main themes that Porter explores.
Sure. So, at its core, competitive strategy is about understanding the forces that shape competition and profitability within an industry. And to analyze this, Porter introduces the famous five forces framework.
The five forces, we'll definitely dig into
Yes.
that. And then Porter goes on to discuss how companies can achieve a competitive advantage. And he outlines three generic strategies: cost, leadership, differentiation, and focus.
And he really emphasizes the importance of choosing one of these strategies and aligning all of your company's activities with it. This is what he calls strategic fit, and he argues that's crucial for long-term success.
Yeah, and something else I thought was really cool about this book is it doesn't just stay theoretical. It actually provides a ton of practical advice and real-world examples.
Yeah, and even though it's published over 40 years ago, as you said, the core concepts are still incredibly relevant in today's business world.
So you ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
Porter starts off strong, right off the bat. He urges us to think about the structure of an industry as the key to developing a really great strategy.
Yeah, he makes the point that it's not enough to focus on your company's strengths and weaknesses. You also need to understand the big picture of the industry.
So it's like saying you wouldn't try to navigate a city without a map.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where the five forces come in. They provide the framework for mapping out the competitive landscape of an industry.
So this framework's probably one of Porter's most well-known contributions. Can you walk us through those five forces?
Of course. So the first force is the threat of new entrants. How easy or difficult is it for new companies to enter the industry and start competing?
I imagine things like high startup costs or regulations could make it really tough.
Exactly. Porter refers to those as barriers to entry. Other barriers can include things like brand loyalty among existing companies, access to distribution channels, and even government policies.
So basically, the harder it is to enter a market, the less likely it is new competitors will pop up.
Right, and the second force is the bargaining power of buyers. This is all about how much leverage customers have when it comes to driving down prices.
This makes me think of Walmart. They buy such huge volumes of products that they have a lot of power to dictate terms to suppliers.
Perfect example. If you're the only game in town for a product, you have a lot of power. But if customers have options and can easily switch, they can play hardball on price.
I see how that power dynamic would have a big impact on an industry's profitability.
Absolutely. The third force flips that and looks at the bargaining power of suppliers. So how much power do suppliers have to raise prices or reduce the quality of what they're providing?
I imagine if a key component of your product is only made by a few companies, those suppliers have a lot of power.
You got it. They can use that power to demand higher prices or more favorable contracts, potentially squeezing profits for the companies they supply. Think about industries like pharmaceuticals or aerospace, where specialized inputs come from a limited number of suppliers.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've got the threat of new entrants, the power of buyers, and the power of suppliers. That's three. What's the fourth force?
The spread of substitute products or services. This one's interesting because it forces you to think outside the boundaries of your industry.
So it's not just about direct competitors, but also products that could serve the same need for a customer.
You got it. Even if those products are completely different, think about sugar producers having to compete with high fructose corn syrup. Even though they're different products, they serve the same purpose, sweetening food and beverages. This threat can limit an industry's pricing power.
Makes you think outside the box. And finally, the fifth force.
The fifth force is rivalry among existing competitors.
Yeah.
This is the classic head-to-head competition within an industry.
I imagine things like the number of competitors, industry growth rate, the level of product differentiation, they all play a role here.
Absolutely. Industries with a lot of similar companies, slow growth and low differentiation tend to be more cutthroat. Companies are fighting for every inch of market share. Think about industries like airlines or fast food with their price wars and ad campaigns.
So Porter's point is that understanding these five forces and how they interact is essential for developing a great competitive strategy.
Exactly. And he gives a lot of examples showing how these forces shape industries like automobiles, airlines, even oil.
So once you've got a map of the competitive landscape, you're using these forces, what's next?
Then you can use Porter's three generic strategies. He says there are three ways for companies to achieve a sustainable competitive advantage: cost leadership, differentiation, and focus.
Let's start with cost leadership. So that's about being the lowest cost producer in your industry.
Right. Companies that can do that successfully can offer lower prices than competitors while still making a profit.
Walmart or Southwest Airlines are the classic examples, right?
Great examples. Cost leadership often involves streamlining operations, cutting overhead, and achieving economies of scale. There's a great quote in the book where Porter says, "The essence of strategy is choosing what not to do." Cost leaders are all about efficiency.
So it's not just about being cheap, it's about making smart choices.
Right. And differentiation is about offering unique products or services that customers want enough to pay more for. It's not about competing on price, but on value.
So companies like Apple or Nike, known for innovative products and strong brands, those are good examples of differentiators.
Absolutely. Differentiation can come from different things like product features, brand reputation, customer service, or even distribution channels. The key is to offer something that customers can't get anywhere else.
And that lets you charge a higher price and build customer loyalty.
Exactly. The third generic strategy focus is about targeting a niche market and becoming a specialist in that niche.
So instead of trying to appeal to everyone, you're focusing on a specific customer or product category.
Exactly. Companies using a focus strategy need to have a deep understanding of their target market and tailor their products or services accordingly.
Makes me think of luxury brands like Ferrari or Rolex catering to a specific customer.
Great examples. A focus strategy can allow companies to achieve cost leadership or differentiation within that chosen segment. So you could be the cost leader in clothes for teens or offer high-end baby food.
Porter makes it clear, though, that companies need to pick one of these strategies and stick with it.
He does. He warns against being stuck in the middle trying to do too many things at once.
Like the jack of all trades, master of none.
Exactly. He uses the example of Crown Cork and Seal in the book. They were doing well focusing on a niche in the metal can industry, but then they tried to diversify and compete with giants like American Can, and they struggled.
So focus is key.
Yeah.
Before we move on to other ideas, are there any takeaways from this that you think our listeners should really remember?
Well, Porter's emphasis on understanding your industry's structure, that's fundamental.
Yeah, using the 5 forces to really get what's going on.
I'd also add it's important to understand the stage of your industry's life cycle.
Mm.
Is it new or mature or declining? The right strategy will depend on that.
Great point. And then choosing the right generic strategy, cost, leadership, differentiation, or focus. That should be based on what you know about your industry and what your company can do well.
We'll talk more about those strategies and what they mean in part 2 of our deep dive. But for now, I think that's a solid look at the foundation Porter lays out in competitive strategy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Welcome back to our deep dive into competitive strategy. So we've laid some groundwork with the 5 forces and the generic strategies.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how these concepts can really be applied to so many different industries and businesses. I'm curious to explore some of the other key ideas that Porter brings up.
Sure. Let's dig into a particularly insightful section, competitor analysis.
Competitor analysis. I mean, this sounds like it's about really getting to know your rivals.
It is. Porter emphasizes that you need to do more than just know who they are. You need to understand their motivations, what they're likely to do next.
So you're not just gathering data, but actually interpreting it to try and figure out their strategy.
Exactly. And he gives a framework for this kind of analysis, understanding your competitors' goals, assumptions, and capabilities.
Assumptions. What does he mean by that?
Assumptions are those beliefs that a competitor holds about their industry and its future. These beliefs can actually really shape their actions. For example, a competitor might assume that the demand for a certain product is going to keep growing, so they invest heavily in expanding. But if that assumption turns out to be wrong...
Could be disaster.
Exactly. But if you understand their assumptions, you can try to anticipate how they'll react to changes or even predict their next moves.
Interesting. So then capabilities are about?
Capabilities are about the strengths and weaknesses of a competitor, analyzing their resources, their processes, their overall ability to compete. Basically, you're looking for areas where you might have an advantage or where you need to improve your own defenses.
So competitor analysis requires some serious detective work.
You could say that Porter suggests looking at their public statements, tracking their investments, even talking to their customers and suppliers. The key takeaway here is that you can't really outmaneuver your competition if you don't know them.
It's like chess. You have to anticipate their moves to win. Now, I know Porter also talks about some of the bigger decisions businesses face, like vertical integration.
He does. Vertical integration is about whether a company should control multiple stages of its value chain, from raw materials to the final product. So a clothing retailer might decide to make their own clothes instead of buying them from suppliers.
What are some of the things companies should think about when making this decision?
Porter talks about both the pros and the cons. Vertical integration can give you more control over quality and costs, but it can also make things more risky and complex. It's a big strategic decision.
So, no easy answer. Every company needs to weigh the factors based on their own industry and goals.
Right. Another big decision Porter explores is capacity expansion.
That sounds simple enough. Just increasing how much a company can
On
produce.
the surface, yes. But Porter goes deeper. He talks about the importance of timing. Expand too early and you might waste resources if demand doesn't materialize. Expand too late and you're playing catch up with competitors, maybe losing market share.
Sounds like you need to find the sweet spot.
It is. He also talks about different ways to expand capacity. Building new facilities, buying existing ones, forming partnerships. It's about choosing the approach that makes sense for the company's strategy and the environment they're in.
He also looks at different kinds of industries and how strategies need to adapt.
Mhm.
We already touched on fragmented industries, but what about emerging industries?
Emerging industries are interesting because they change so quickly. New companies, new technologies, new business models pop up all the time. So Porter emphasizes the importance of shaping how the industry evolves. Early movers can get a big advantage if they establish standards, build brand recognition, and secure key
They
resources.
get to write the rules.
Often they do. He uses the example of the early days of personal computers. Companies like Apple and IBM were fighting to set the standard for operating systems and hardware. The winners are usually the ones who can anticipate change and adapt quickly.
And on the opposite end, you have declining industries.
Declining industries are a different challenge. Demand is shrinking, and competition among the companies that are left can be really intense. Porter gives a few options for companies in this situation. They could try to get as much short-term cash flow as possible, find niche segments that are still profitable, or even just get out of the business altogether.
So you have to really assess the long-term outlook and choose the best course of action.
Exactly. Competitive strategy gives a good framework for understanding those dynamics and making strategic choices. Even in a declining industry, there might be opportunities for companies that are smart about it.
So we've covered competitor analysis, strategic decisions about vertical integration and capacity expansion, and we've touched on how strategies need to change based on the industry. Before we wrap up this part, I want to bring up another key idea that Porter talks about: offensive and defensive strategies.
Good one. Porter argues that companies need to be good at both offensive and defensive moves to succeed in a competitive environment.
What does he mean by offensive strategy?
Offensive strategies are about taking proactive steps to gain market share or weaken your rivals. This could be launching new products, entering new markets, or using aggressive pricing.
So it's about going after opportunities to disrupt the market and get ahead of the competition.
Exactly. But Porter says these offensive moves need to be carefully planned. You need to choose your battles and use your strengths effectively.
And defensive strategies.
Defensive strategies are about protecting what you already have, fending off attacks from competitors. Things like strengthening relationships with customers, improving product quality, or even building barriers to entry.
So you're making it harder for rivals to take your customers.
Exactly. And Porter says that defensive moves shouldn't be passive or just reactions. They need just as much strategic thinking as offensive moves.
It seems like this balance between offense and defense is especially important today when competition is so fierce and markets are always changing.
I agree. Companies need to be adaptable, able to take advantage of opportunities, but also protect their core business. Competitive strategy gives us a really useful way to think about these decisions and make smart choices that improve competitiveness.
Welcome back to Books and Bytes. We've been really digging into Michael Porter's competitive strategy.
Yeah, and we've covered a lot: the five forces, the generic strategies, competitor analysis, vertical integration, even how to deal with different industry environments.
And it's amazing how relevant all of this still is all these years later.
Absolutely. Porter's ideas have really stood the test of time. But before we wrap up our deep dive, I think there's one more key concept we should touch on.
Okay, what's that?
Porter's emphasis on the importance of fit. He argues that everything a company does needs to be consistent and aligned with its strategy. This is what he calls strategic fit.
So you don't just pick a strategy, you have to make sure your whole company supports it.
Exactly. Think of it this way. If you're going for cost leadership, then everything you do, your operations marketing, even your company culture, should be focused on efficiency and controlling costs. Every decision, every investment has to support that strategy.
But if you're trying to differentiate yourself, then you might need to invest more in things like R&D, design, customer service, the things that make your product unique.
Exactly. And if you're using a focus strategy, you need to really understand that niche market you're targeting and tailor your products to their specific needs.
So Porter's saying that this strategic fit is essential for building a competitive advantage that lasts.
It is. It's like building a house. If the foundation's weak and the pieces don't fit together, the whole thing falls apart.
So how can companies actually achieve this strategic fit?
Porter gives some practical advice. He talks about clear communication, making sure everyone in the company understands the strategy and their role in it.
So it's not just a decision made at the top. Everyone has to be on board.
Right. He also emphasizes the importance of strong leadership to make sure the strategy is implemented and to make those tough choices about where to invest. Sometimes that means saying no to projects that might seem good, but don't fit the overall strategy.
So it takes discipline and a willingness to make tough choices.
It does, but the rewards can be big.
Yeah.
Companies that achieve strategic fit are usually more efficient, more innovative, and ultimately more profitable.
It's like creating a system where everything works together toward the same goal.
Exactly. And I think that's a great point to end our deep dive on competitive strategy.
We've just scratched the surface of this book, but I hope our listeners have a better understanding of Porter's main ideas.
Absolutely. From the 5 forces to the generic strategies, competitor analysis, strategic fit, it's all in there. Competitive strategy is a must-read for anyone who wants to understand competition and how to develop a winning strategy.
And even though so much has changed in the business world since this book came out, the basic principles are still incredibly relevant. Whether you're a CEO, an entrepreneur, or just interested in business, this book has something for you.
And that wraps up our deep dive into competitive strategy.
Thanks for joining us on Books and Bytes. We hope you found it insightful. Until next time.